London, early 1945. A correspondent walking through the corridors of Whitehall would see officials drafting reports, balancing colonial ledgers, and speaking of the empire as the greatest force for civilization the world has ever known. From that desk, the view is tidy. From the ground in Bengal, in Nairobi, in the Punjab, in Dhaka, in Cork, the view is something else entirely. This is a report from that ground. The British Empire at its height covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruled over close to a quarter of its population. Its official records, its parliamentary debates, its military archives, and the diaries of the people who lived under it have all survived, in varying amounts, to the present day. What those records describe when placed side by side is not the tidy version. What follows are 10 of the brutal realities documented inside that empire, reported in the order the archives make clear. Section 1. The Great Bengal Famine of 1943. Calcutta. The autumn of 1943. On the footpaths outside the grand colonial buildings, people are dying of hunger in a province that has not run out of food. This is the detail that matters most about what is happening in Bengal. The rice harvest of 1943 is not a failure. The province is not empty of grain. And yet, by the time the dying slows in the middle of 1944, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people will be dead. Most scholars working on the period settle on a figure of around 2.1 million. Though some estimates go higher. The deaths are not spread evenly across society. They fall almost entirely on the rural poor, landless laborers, fishermen, weavers, small tenant farmers, and their children. To understand how this is possible, a correspondent has to look at what the war has done to the province. In 1942, Japan takes Burma. Burma was the source of a significant portion of the rice that Bengal normally imports. That supply is now cut off. At the same time, the British Indian government, fearing a Japanese invasion of the Bengal coast, begins what it calls the denial policy. Fishing boats along the coast are seized or destroyed so they cannot be used by an invading enemy. Rice stockpiles in coastal districts are removed or purchased at government rates and shipped inland. This wrecks the livelihood of fishermen and the local trade networks that the rural poor rely on every day for survival. In October 1942, a cyclone strikes the southwestern coast of Bengal. Flooding destroys part of the rice crop. A fungal disease attacks what remains. And yet, the 1943 crop, when it is counted, is not catastrophically short. Scholars who have examined the figures, including Paul Greenough, conclude that roughly 90% of the usual rice supply is available in 1943. Neighboring provinces, Bihar, Orissa, Assam, have grain to spare. What happens next is the decision that turns a difficult year into a mass killing. The provincial government in Bengal, under pressure from the war effort, prioritizes food for Calcutta. The city is the headquarters of the British military effort in the Asian theater. It houses the factories that produce uniforms, munitions, and supplies for the army fighting in Burma. Workers in Calcutta, classified as essential to the war, are placed in priority rations. The rural population is not. Grain is pulled into the city. Prices outside the city rise sharply. Speculation and hoarding follow. Within months, the cost of rice in rural Bengal is several times what a farm laborer or rickshaw puller can earn in a day. At the imperial level, the response is worse. The viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, makes half-hearted requests for food imports from other parts of the empire. The War Cabinet in London, under Winston Churchill, refuses. Shipping, the cabinet argues, must be reserved for the war effort. The Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, records the arguments in his diary. In one of the most quoted entries, Churchill dismisses Indian suffering with a remark about Indians breeding like rabbits. In another, Amery notes that Churchill appears more concerned with feeding Greeks, whom he considers sturdier, than starving Bengalis. The numbers make the choice plain. In 1943, at the height of the famine, Britain imports 26 million tons of food for its own civilian population, and finishes the year with a stockpile of roughly 18 million tons. Wheat harvested across the empire during 1943 and 1944 amounts to around 29 million tons, and most of it is held in reserve. Australia has wheat. Canada has wheat. Ships are available for other imperial tasks. None of it is sent to Bengal in time. Inside the province, the human reality becomes impossible to hide. In Calcutta, by the middle of 1943, starving rural migrants are pouring into the city in search of food. They sleep on pavements. They die on pavements. The Statesman newspaper publishes photographs of emaciated bodies. The editor, Ian Stevens, defies the wartime censorship rules in doing so. The photographs reach London. They reach Washington. The silence begins to crack. Starvation is only the first wave. Once bodies are weakened, disease moves through the province in a second wave that kills longer and slower. Malaria becomes the biggest killer. Cholera spreads through refugee camps and contaminated water sources. Dysentery empties villages. The Famine Inquiry Commission, sitting after the worst is over, records that victims in the streets and hospitals of Calcutta resemble, in its own phrase, living skeletons. Relief, when it finally comes, arrives late. The provincial government never formally declares a famine, which would have triggered automatic emergency measures under the old Indian famine codes written decades earlier. The British Indian Army is not handed control of food distribution until October 1943, by which point most of the starvation deaths have already occurred. Lord Wavell, who replaces Linlithgow as Viceroy in late 1943, is shocked by what he sees when he tours Bengal. In his private journal, he calls the response of his own government to the crisis disgraceful. What the correspondent on the ground in the autumn of 1943 can see, without the benefit of hindsight, is this. A province inside one of the wealthiest empires in history is watching its rural poor starve to death while grain moves through its ports on imperial business. The food exists. The ships exist. The decision not to use them is a decision, not an accident. By the time the dying finishes and the commission reports are filed, a figure in the low millions is gone. The survivors carry the memory forward. For the rest of the 20th century, in the villages where the hunger came, people will speak of it simply as 50, the year 1350 in the Bengali calendar. Bengal is the last great famine under British rule, but it is not the first. To understand the shape of what the empire did on the subcontinent, a correspondent has to look back further, to the long line of hungers that came before, in the years when Queen Victoria was still on the throne. Section 2. The Late Victorian Famines of India, 1876 to 1902. Madras Presidency. The summer of 1877. A correspondent walking through the villages of the southern Deccan finds people boiling leaves, eating bark, walking dozens of miles toward government relief camps that most of them will not survive reaching. In the quarter century that covers the last years of Victoria, the Indian subcontinent experiences a sequence of mass deaths that make the earlier hungers of the 19th century look small. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 kills somewhere around 5.5 million people across the Madras Presidency, Bombay Presidency, Mysore, Hyderabad, and the northwestern provinces. The famine of 1896 to 1897 kills another 5 million across a vast swath of the country. The famine of 1899 to 1900, arriving on the back of a failed monsoon during Lord Curzon's term as Viceroy, adds another million. Taken together, the Victorian era in India sees roughly 29 million famine-related deaths on the lowest serious estimates, with some historians placing the figure considerably higher. The monsoon is the trigger. In 1877, the rains fall short by around 30%, the worst year in more than a century of recorded rainfall. The Deccan Plateau, which depends almost entirely on monsoon water because it has no river-fed irrigation like the north, dries out. Wells empty. Wheat and millet shrivel in the field. Cattle die. A second failed monsoon the following year turns the shortage into a collapse. But a failed monsoon is not the same thing as a famine. What makes the disaster of 1876 to 1878 one of the worst mortality events of the 19th century is what the British government does with the shortage. The Viceroy of India during the crisis is Lord Lytton, appointed by the Conservative Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Lytton holds firmly to the economic doctrine of laissez-faire. His position is that the government should not interfere with the grain market. Even as the southern districts empty out, Lytton permits, and in places encourages, the continued export of grain from India to Britain. During the famine years of 1877 and 1878, India exports record quantities of wheat to British ports. Journalists in India at the time, including William Digby of the Madras Times, report on the grim irony. Grain trains rolling north through stations where the bodies of the starving lie piled along the tracks. Lytton's administration does set up relief works, but the conditions are designed around a principle that the government's own officials debate at the time. The Temple wage, named for Sir Richard Temple, is a daily ration provided to laborers in the relief camps. It sets the ration at 1 pound of rice per adult per day, along with a small amount of pulse and vegetable. British medical officers at the time calculate that this ration provides fewer calories than what is later fed to inmates of Nazi concentration camps. Temple defends the low ration on the grounds that it must not be so generous that it attracts people who are not truly starving. The death rates inside the relief camps are staggering. Some camps record mortality rates above 90% among those admitted. People walk for days to reach them, arrive too weak to digest food, and die within a week. Lytton's other major decision is to block grain from moving between provinces. Provincial barriers on internal trade are enforced. Grain merchants who wish to move rice from surplus regions like Bengal to deficit regions in the south face restrictions that kill the normal commercial movement of food. Mike Davis, in his study of the period, draws the comparison bluntly. A drought is a natural event. A famine of this scale, in a province connected to the world by railways and telegraph lines, is a policy. The imperial response is also shaped by who is listening. In London, the celebrations of Queen Victoria being proclaimed Empress of India go ahead in 1877 at a cost of around £100,000. That same year, Lytton's government declares that no more than £1.5 million of relief can be spent in the Madras Presidency. The Viceroy hosts a grand Delhi Durbar to announce the new title, while the southern districts are burying their dead. Out of the catastrophe comes a reform. The Famine Commission of 1880, appointed under the pressure of public outrage in both Britain and India, produces the Famine Code. The code lays out triggers for relief, standards for ration levels above the temple wage, and procedures for provincial coordination. When the next famines come, in 1896 and 1899, the code is used, but imperfectly and with wide regional variation. Curzon, the viceroy during the 1899 to 1900 famine, is accused by contemporary critics of reducing relief efforts in the name of fiscal discipline. The Lancet Medical Journal in 1901 estimates that 19 million Indians died in western India during the famine decade of the 1890s, though later scholars have argued this figure is too high. What the correspondent can observe by the end of Victoria's reign is a pattern. India is now bound by rail and telegraph. Food can move, information can move, and yet, decade by decade, millions are dying of hunger in a subcontinent that is, by the empire's own accounting, exporting grain. The debate among historians about exactly how much blame to assign to British policy continues today. Some, like Tirthankar Roy, emphasize the limits of 19th century states to cope with weather shocks, and credit the famine codes as evidence that the administration did learn. Others, like Davis and Amartya Sen, point out that famines of this scale did not occur under the Mughal emperors before British rule, and argue that the combination of free trade ideology, revenue extraction, and administrative indifference produced something closer to a structural killing machine. What is not in dispute is the body count. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Yet the wealth that the empire was extracting in this period did not come only from Indian grain or Indian land. It came from something older, crueler, and carried across a different ocean. Section 3. The Atlantic Slave Trade under British Shipping. Liverpool. The summer of 1783, a correspondent walking the docks of one of Britain's richest cities would see warehouses stacked with sugar, tobacco, rum, and cotton, goods produced on plantations thousands of miles away by people who have been taken from their homes and shipped across an ocean in the holds of British vessels. Britain is not the first European country to enter the Atlantic slave trade, but by the middle of the 18th century, it has become the largest. Between 1640 and 1807, the year Parliament finally bans the trade, British ships transport around 3.4 million African men, women, and children across the Atlantic. Of those, roughly 450,000 die during the crossing itself. The rest arrived to be sold at auction in the Caribbean and the American colonies, where the average life expectancy of a newly landed enslaved person on a sugar plantation is around 3 years. The trade is organized through 3 main ports, London, Bristol, and Liverpool, with Liverpool overtaking the others by the middle of the 18th century. The ships leave British harbors loaded with manufactured goods. They sail to the coast of West Africa, to ports on what the British call the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, and the Bight of Biafra. There, the cargo is exchanged with African traders and rulers for human beings who have been captured inland, sometimes in wars, sometimes in raids specifically organized to feed the slave markets. The captives are then held in coastal fortresses built by European traders. The Royal African Company, founded under Royal Charter in 1672, operates several of these. One of the largest is Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana. Inside the dungeons beneath the castle, hundreds of people at a time are kept in the dark, chained, and waiting for a ship. A passage at the far end of the dungeon leads to a single door opening onto the beach. It is called the Door of No Return. From there, the crossing begins. Historians call it the Middle Passage because it is the middle leg of the triangular trade. On a British ship of the period, between 350 and 450 captives are packed below deck, chained in pairs, with space so tight that individuals cannot sit upright. The voyage lasts on average 2 to 3 months. Men are kept almost permanently shackled. Women and children are sometimes allowed briefly on deck. Disease moves through the hold constantly. Dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy are the biggest killers. The overall mortality rate on the Middle Passage across the full history of the trade is around 12 to 15%, though early voyages in the 17th century had higher rates still. Resistance is a constant feature. The records of British shipping firms include hundreds of documented revolts. Most fail. Those involved are hanged, dismembered, or thrown overboard alive as a warning to the rest. Others resist by refusing food. The crew have iron instruments designed to force open the mouth of any captive who tries to starve themselves to death. Some choose to jump over the side rather than continue. To prevent this, British slavers hang netting around the sides of the ship during the voyage. In 1781, a single incident captures the character of the trade with unusual clarity. A Liverpool-owned vessel called the Zong sets out from the coast of West Africa carrying 442 captives, more than twice the number the ship can safely hold. Navigation errors during the crossing leave the ship adrift. The water supply falls. Captives and crew begin to die from sickness. The captain, Luke Collingwood, makes a decision. Over 3 days at the end of November, the crew throw at least 132 living people into the sea. When the Zong reaches Jamaica, the owners file an insurance claim for the lost cargo at £30 per head. The insurers refuse to pay. The case ends up in a London court in 1783. The question in front of the judges is not whether a crime has occurred. Under English law at the time, the deliberate killing of enslaved Africans at sea is not classified as murder. The question is purely whether the owners can claim their compensation. The Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield, says in open court that the case should be treated as if horses had been thrown overboard. The abolitionist Granville Sharp and the formerly enslaved writer Olaudah Equiano use the Zong case to push the horrors of the trade into public view. For the first time, large numbers of ordinary British people begin to understand what is happening on the ships that fund their ports. The campaign to abolish the trade takes decades. William Wilberforce begins presenting bills to Parliament in 1791. Every year they are defeated. Finally, in 1807, Parliament passes the Slave Trade Act, which bans British ships from carrying enslaved Africans. Slavery itself in British colonies is not abolished for another 26 years, until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 takes effect in 1834. The abolition comes with a bill. Parliament votes to pay compensation of £20 million, around 40% of the entire national budget of the year, to the slave owners for the loss of their human property. No money is paid to the roughly 800,000 enslaved people who are freed. Further, the act imposes a 4-year period of unpaid apprenticeship on most of those freed, meaning full emancipation does not arrive until 1838. The British government borrows the £20 million to fund the compensation. The loan is so large that, when adjusted across the generations, it is not finally paid off by the British taxpayer until the year 2015. For most of the 20th century, every person in Britain who paid tax contributed, without knowing it, to settling the debt that freed the enslaved by paying their owners. The wealth of the Atlantic trade, however, was built partly on the back of another population the empire had already been reshaping for 2 centuries. The hunger that hit the empire's oldest conquest was not in India or Africa. It was much closer to home. Section 4. The Irish Great Hunger, 1845 to 1852. County Cork, the winter of 1846. A correspondent walking the lanes outside Skibbereen finds families crouched in ditches, children with hollow eyes, whole cottages abandoned with the doors open and the occupants already buried in the fields outside. In London, the ships unloading at the Thames are carrying butter, grain, and livestock from Irish ports. This is the part of the story that stays with people once they learn it. Ireland during the Great Hunger is not a country with no food. It is a country that is exporting food while its people starve. The trigger is a disease. In late 1845, a fungal infection called Phytophthora infestans arrives in Ireland from North America. It attacks the potato plant. The leaves blacken. The tubers rot in the ground. A healthy field can turn into a field of slime within days. Roughly a third of the potato crop is lost in that first year. It is a serious blow, but on its own, it is not a catastrophe. What makes the disaster is that the blight returns the following year, much worse. In 1846, around 3/4 of the potato crop fails. It returns again in 1848 and 1849. For the section of the Irish population that depends on the potato as almost its entire source of food, around 3 million people, mostly tenant farmers and laborers in the western and southern counties, there is, simply, nothing left to eat. To understand why one crop failure produces this level of suffering, a correspondent has to look at the structure of the country. Ireland in the 1840s has a population of around 8.5 million people. It is governed directly from London under the Act of Union of 1801, which abolished the Irish Parliament and made Ireland part of the United Kingdom. The land is owned, in large part, by absentee landlords who live in England and collect rents through agents. The tenants on these estates hold tiny plots, often under 2 hectares, on short leases. Their rent is paid either in cash earned from selling grain and livestock or in labor. The food they grow to sell goes to the landlord or to the export market. The food they grow to eat on the smallest corner of the plot is almost entirely potatoes because no other crop produces enough calories per acre to feed a family on that scale of land. When the potato fails, the tenants have no food. And because they still owe rent, they also have no money to buy imported food, which is what the rest of Europe does during the same blight. The proximate cause is the fungus. The reason 1 million people die is the system that sits on top of the fungus. The British government under Sir Robert Peel, Conservative Prime Minister at the outbreak, responds in the first year with a modest program. Peel buys 100,000 pounds worth of maize from the United States and ships it to Ireland, intending to sell it cheaply and keep food prices down. He also begins the process of repealing the Corn Laws, the tariffs on imported grain. His measures are imperfect, but they save lives. In June 1846, Peel's government falls. He is replaced by the Liberal, also called Whig, administration of Lord John Russell. Russell and his Treasury official Charles Trevelyan, who is put in charge of famine relief, hold firmly to the doctrine of laissez-faire. Their position is that the market must not be interfered with. Government food depots are wound down. Private grain exports are not blocked. Ration distributions are replaced with public works schemes in which starving men are paid a few pence to break stones on roads that go nowhere. Many collapse and die on the work sites. The food exports continue throughout the famine. In the first 9 months of 1847, the worst year, over 820,000 gallons of butter are shipped from Irish ports to Bristol and Liverpool alone. Wheat, oats, barley, pork, beef, and eggs leave the country in quantities more than sufficient to feed the starving if they had been kept inside Ireland. The historian Cormac O'Grada has noted that Ireland during the famine was producing and exporting enough grain to feed the population several times over. The food was private property, the government would not requisition it, and the people who needed it had no money to buy it. In 1847, under pressure from reports reaching London of mass death, the government opens soup kitchens. At their peak, these feed around 3 million people a day. They are shut down after only a few months on cost grounds. The burden of relief is then shifted onto the Irish Poor Law, which requires Irish landlords and taxpayers to fund workhouses, where the starving are sent to labor in exchange for food. The workhouses are overwhelmed. Disease sweeps through them. Typhus, dysentery, and relapsing fever kill more people than pure starvation. Evictions accelerate. Landlords, faced with tenants who cannot pay rent, clear their estates. The roofs are pulled off cottages to prevent the tenants returning. Hundreds of thousands of people are thrown onto the roads in the middle of winter. Many die of exposure within days. The numbers at the end of the period are stark. Around 1 million people die from starvation and related disease between 1845 and 1852. Another 1 to 2 million emigrate, mostly to the United States, often on ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden they become known as coffin ships. Ireland's population falls from 8.5 million before the famine to 6.6 million by 1851. By 1901, it stands at only 4.4 million. No country in modern European history has lost as large a share of its population in peacetime. The economist Joel Mokyr later puts the British government's choice in the bluntest possible terms. Britain spent around £9.5 million on Irish famine relief. A few years later, it spent £63.9 million on the Crimean War. The Empire's commitment to the free movement of goods, regardless of who starved or died, was about to be tested again. This time, thousands of miles to the east, over a cargo worth more than all the grain of Ireland, and one that created millions of addicts in the process. Section 5. The Opium Wars and the Narcotic Subjugation of China, 1839 to 1860. Guangzhou, the summer of 1839. A correspondent standing on the beach at Human would watch an official of the Chinese imperial government, a man named Lin Zhe-zhu, oversee the destruction of roughly 1,400 tons of opium, mixed with lime and salt water and flushed into the sea. The opium belongs to British merchants. What follows that moment is 2 decades of war and the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. To understand why this happens, a correspondent has to follow the money backwards. In the early 19th century, Britain has a problem with China. British consumers have developed a deep love of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. The Chinese, by contrast, want very little of what Britain produces. The only currency the Qing government will accept in exchange for its goods is silver. And so, for decades, British silver has been flowing steadily east, creating a serious drain on the British treasury. The East India Company, which holds the British monopoly on trade with the East, finds a solution in the poppy fields of Bengal. Opium grown in India, processed into a smokable form, sold through middlemen on the Chinese coast. The company does not carry the opium itself. It licenses private merchants, known as country traders, to do the work. The growth of the trade is not slow. In 1729, China imports around 200 chests of opium per year. By 1820, that figure is around 10,000. By 1838, it is around 40,000 chests per year. Each chest contains roughly 140 pounds of the drug. The Chinese government sees what is happening to its population. Opium has been banned in China since 1729, with the ban tightened in 1796 and again in 1813. None of the bans hold. The drug is being smuggled into the country on British and American ships, distributed through a network of Chinese traders, and consumed at every level of society. By the 1830s, officials in the Qing army are addicted. Members of the imperial household are addicted. In some coastal regions, by some contemporary estimates, as much as 90% of the adult population is using the drug. In 1839, the Daoguang Emperor sends Lin Zezhu to Guangzhou with orders to end the trade. Lin is a disciplined and incorruptible Confucian official. He writes an open letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her sense of moral responsibility. The letter never reaches her. He arrests Chinese dealers. He surrounds the foreign merchant enclave. He demands the surrender of all opium stocks. When the British merchants finally hand them over, Lin destroys the lot on the beach at Humen over the course of 23 days. The British government's response is to send a naval expedition. The First Opium War runs from 1839 to 1842. The British fleet, with steam-powered iron gunboats and modern rifles, is technologically far ahead of anything the Qing forces can put into the field. British warships sail up the Pearl River. They blockade ports. They sail north and threaten the mouth of the Yangtze. The Qing military, which has not fought a serious external war in a generation, loses battle after battle. During the parliamentary debate of 1840, William Gladstone, then a young Conservative MP and later a British Prime Minister, stands up in the House of Commons and denounces the war as unjust. He says the British flag has become a pirate flag, hoisted to protect an infamous traffic. The government wins the vote on the war anyway, by a margin of 9 votes. The war ends with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. China is forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain. 5 ports, including Shanghai, are opened for British trade. China is forced to pay a large indemnity. British citizens in China are placed outside the reach of Chinese law. The opium trade is not formally legalized by the treaty, but the enforcement that Lin Zezhu had tried to impose is gone. Imports of the drug resume and expand. 14 years later, the British government decides the concessions are not enough. In 1856, using as a pretext the boarding of a British registered ship called the Arrow by Chinese officials, Britain launches the Second Opium War, this time with France joining as an ally. The fighting drags on until 1860. In October of that year, British and French forces march on Beijing. The Qing Emperor Xianfeng flees the capital. On 6th and 7th October, Anglo-French troops reach the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace, a vast complex of gardens, pavilions, and libraries that has served as the imperial residence for more than a century. Over several days, the soldiers loot the palace of its treasures. Jade, porcelain, bronze, scrolls, and manuscripts are carried off. One estimate by UNESCO, made much later, puts the number of items removed from the old summer palace during this period at around 1 million. On October 18, 1860, under the orders of the British High Commissioner Lord Elgin, some 3,500 British troops set fire to what remains. The fire burns for 3 days. Around 300 palace eunuchs and servants who have hidden in locked rooms are killed in the flames. Among the British soldiers taking part is a young captain of the Royal Engineers named Charles Gordon, later to die at Khartoum. In a letter home, he writes that it made his heart sore to burn the palaces, and calls the action, in his own words, vandal-like. The Second Opium War ends with the Convention of Peking. The opium trade is now formally legal in China. More treaty ports are opened. Christian missionaries are granted free access. Britain extends its control over Hong Kong with the addition of Kowloon. The imperial government is broken. The wars and the treaties built on them left scars that Britain has yet to fully reckon with. But when empires reach for new conquests, their armies find old methods useful. A generation after Beijing, those same methods would be exported, and the world would see them turned on a new kind of civilian. Section 6. The Boer War Concentration Camps, 1900 to 1902. The Transvaal, the winter of 1901. A correspondent riding out from a railway line in what had been the South African Republic would see something that a European observer in previous wars had never seen on this scale. Farmhouses, one after another, burned to their foundations. Wheat fields set alight. Cattle shot where they stood. Wells poisoned. And, along the railway, rows of white canvas tents where the women and children of the destroyed farms had been placed by the British Army. The Second Anglo-Boer War runs from October 1899 to May 1902. It begins as a conventional war between the British Empire and two small Afrikaner republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. The cause is partly the discovery of vast gold deposits in the Transvaal in the 1880s, and the refusal of the Boer government to grant political rights to the British settlers who have moved in to mine them. By mid-1900, the British have captured the capitals of both republics. London believes the war is over. It is not. The Boer commandos, small units of mounted riflemen, melt into the countryside and begin a guerrilla war. They strike at railway lines and supply columns, then disappear into the farmland, where the civilian population hides them, feeds them, and replaces the horses that die under them. For the British, who have committed around 450,000 troops at the war's peak, this is a nightmare. The regular army is designed to fight other regular armies. It does not know how to fight ghosts. The commander who is sent to solve the problem is Lord Kitchener, who replaces Lord Roberts as commander-in-chief in late 1900. Kitchener's answer is to attack the countryside itself. From late 1900, the British Army implements what it calls the scorched earth policy. Columns of troops ride out across the veldt with instructions to destroy anything the commandos might use. Over the course of the war, around 30,000 Boer farmhouses are burned. More than 40 towns are partially or entirely destroyed. Livestock, the foundation of Afrikaner rural life, is slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands. The fields are salted or burned. What is left behind is a landscape that cannot support human life. That creates a new problem. The women, children, and elderly men who had lived on those farms are now destitute. They have no shelter, no food, and nowhere to go. Kitchener's answer is to collect them and place them in enclosed, tented settlements along the railway lines. The British call them concentration camps, from the Spanish term reconcentración, used during the Cuban War a few years earlier. The word does not yet carry the meaning it will later acquire. The methods, however, anticipate much of what the 20th century will come to recognize. A separate system of camps is built for black Africans who have worked on the Boer farms. They are held apart from the white inmates under worse conditions, and their records are kept even more poorly, an indication in itself of how the administration sees them. By August 1901, Kitchener's command reports that around 93,940 white Boer inmates and 24,457 black Africans are in camps. At their peak, the combined populations reach close to 150,000 and 115,000 respectively. The rations are minimal. They are divided into two tiers. Families of Boer men who have surrendered receive a slightly better ration. Families of men still fighting receive less, and in most camps the reduced ration does not include any meat. The tents are overcrowded. Sanitation is poor. Water supplies are often contaminated. Into this environment, disease moves quickly. Measles, typhoid, and dysentery sweep through the camps. Children whose immune systems are weakest are hit hardest. In October 1901, the overall death rate inside the white camps is running at 344 per thousand per year. Among infants, it is 629 per thousand. At that rate, more than half the children in the camps would have been dead within a year. The British public does not know any of this for most of 1901. The woman who changes that is an English social reformer named Emily Hobhouse. She is the delegate of the South African Women and Children's Distress Fund, and she travels out to South Africa in late 1900 to see for herself what the camps are like. What she records is devastating. She describes tents full of sick children, mothers with no means to cook the rations they receive, and a medical system completely overwhelmed. On her return to Britain, she writes a 15-page report. It is circulated among members of Parliament in June 1901. The political response inside Britain splits the country. The Liberal Party leader, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, delivers a speech asking his colleagues when a war is not a war. His answer is that it is not a war when it is being carried on by methods of barbarism in South Africa. The government majority holds firm against motions of condemnation, but the public outcry forces the administration to send out an official inquiry led by Millicent Fawcett. Her commission, visiting between August and December 1901, confirms almost every one of Hobhouse's findings. The Colonial Office takes over the camps from the military in November 1901. Rations are improved, medical staff are brought in. By February 1902, the death rate in the white camps has fallen to roughly 69 per thousand. By May, it is around 20 per thousand, below the peacetime norm for South Africa at the time. The improvement comes too late for most of the dead. The final official figures, produced after the war, record the deaths of 27,927 white Boer inmates. Of those, around 22,074 are children under the age of 16, roughly half of all Boer children in the camp population. Among the black African inmates, the official count is 14,154 dead, although historians believe the true figure is considerably higher because records in those camps were barely kept at all. Combined, the deaths in the camp system are probably in the region of 45,000 to 50,000 human beings, most of them children. Quote, _2__. The methods Britain trialed on the veldt did not stay on the veldt. Half a century later, in another colony and against another enemy, an older version of the same machine would be bolted back together. But this time, the records would be hidden away for half a century before anyone forced them into the light. Section 7. The Kenyan Emergency and the Mau Mau Detention System, 1952 to 1960. Nairobi. The autumn of 1952. A correspondent arriving in the capital of British East Africa would find a colony that, on the surface, looks orderly. Coffee estates in the highlands, Europeans in club ties, African servants at the gates, and underneath is already breaking apart. In October of that year, the colonial government declares a state of emergency. What follows is a war Britain will fight against its own African subjects for the next 8 years, and then spend the next half-century trying to hide. To understand what the Mau Mau uprising is, a correspondent has to understand the land. Since the early 1900s, the British have reserved the best farmland in Kenya, the fertile highlands, exclusively for white settlers. The Kikuyu, the largest ethnic group in the country, have been pushed onto reserves that cannot support their population. Many become squatters on white-owned farms, working for rations. By the end of the Second World War, land hunger among the Kikuyu is severe. Political movements demanding the return of stolen land, first peaceful, later armed, grow through the late 1940s. In 1952, a faction known to the British as the Mau Mau, though its members often call themselves the Land and Freedom Army, begins attacking white settlers, police stations, and Africans who have cooperated with the colonial administration. The attacks are brutal. Over the course of the entire emergency, 32 white settlers are killed, along with roughly 2,000 African loyalists. The British response is not proportionate to those numbers. It is catastrophically larger. The colonial government declares the emergency on October 20th, 1952. British troops are flown in. Tens of thousands of Kikuyu are arrested and moved into a network of detention camps that are built across the colony. By the time the system reaches its full size, more than 100 camps have been constructed. The official number of detainees held without trial over the course of the emergency is around 80,000. The historian David Anderson estimates the true figure may be as high as 150,000. At the same time, around 1 million Kikuyu civilians are forcibly relocated into fortified villages, separated from their land and placed under curfew. Inside the camps, a system known as the pipeline is created. Detainees are sorted by perceived political danger, from gray to black, and moved between camps until the administration believes they have been, in its own language, rehabilitated. Rehabilitation in practice means confession. A detainee must admit to having taken the Mau Mau oath, regardless of whether he has. To extract that confession, the camps use violence. What was done inside the camps was denied for decades by the British government. Official statements during the 1950s described the system as humane. When accusations of torture appeared in the press, they were dismissed as isolated incidents carried out by a few individuals. The truth was not forced into the open until 2011, when a group of elderly Kenyan survivors sued the British Foreign Office in the High Court in London. During the litigation, the lawyers for the claimants asked to see colonial-era files. The Foreign Office initially claimed no such files existed. Under pressure from the court, a cache of documents was eventually located at a secure government facility at Hanslope Park in Milton Keynes. The cache, known to historians as the Hanslope Disclosure, turned out to contain over 8,000 files from 37 former British colonies. Many had been removed from the colonies on the eve of independence under a program codenamed Operation Legacy, which had also destroyed thousands more files to prevent them falling into the hands of the new African governments. The files that survived describe what the camps were actually like. Detainees were beaten with batons, whips, and fists. They were kept in solitary confinement. They were starved, deprived of water, denied medical treatment. They were forced to work for long hours in punishing heat. There is extensive documentation of sexual violence, including rape of female detainees and castration of male detainees. Electric shock was used. One recorded technique involved tying the detainee's hands and dragging him face down behind a vehicle. The files show that these practices were not the work of rogue officers. They were sanctioned by senior officials in Nairobi and known to senior officials in London. The most public scandal of the period came on March 3, 1959, at a camp on the coastal plain called Hola. 85 detainees who had refused to work were marched outside the camp by African warders acting under British supervision. A plan had been drawn up by a senior prisons official named Cowan, permitting the use of force to compel labor. That morning, the guards carried it out. They beat the detainees with batons. 11 men were beaten to death on the spot. More than 70 others were seriously injured. The first government statement, issued the next day, said the men had died after drinking contaminated water. The medical examiner's report contradicted the official account. Post-mortems found multiple fractures, lacerations, and internal injuries consistent with repeated beatings. In the British House of Commons, the Labour MP Barbara Castle forced a debate. No one was ever criminally prosecuted. The camp commandant was asked to retire quietly with a gratuity. The town itself was renamed to help the memory fade. The Hola killings accelerated the end of the emergency. The camp system was wound down over the following months. Kenya moved toward independence, which came in 1963. 50 years after the events, in June 2013, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague stood in the House of Commons and read a statement acknowledging that Kenyans had been tortured and abused by the colonial administration. The British government paid £19.9 million in compensation to around 50 elderly survivors. What was buried in the hills of Hanslope Park was already fading from living memory when the files emerged. But while Britain was ending its African empire through violence, it was ending its Asian empire through something else. A line drawn in 5 weeks by a man who had never set foot on the subcontinent he was dividing. Section 8. The Partition of India, 1947. Delhi. The summer of 1947. A correspondent walking the corridors of the Viceroy's residence would see something extraordinary for an empire that has ruled the subcontinent for nearly 2 centuries. The British are leaving. The question is no longer whether, it is how fast, and at what cost to the people they are leaving behind. The answer that is chosen is the fastest possible, and the cost is measured in corpses on trains. At the start of 1947, British rule in India is collapsing under its own weight. The Second World War has emptied the British treasury. The Indian independence movement, led by the Indian National Congress under Jawaharlal Nehru and by the All India Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, has grown too large to suppress. Strikes and mutinies have spread through the Indian armed forces. The Labour government of Clement Attlee has already decided that India must be given its independence. The only remaining disputes are the shape of the new country and the speed of departure. In March 1947, a new viceroy arrives in Delhi. Lord Louis Mountbatten, a royal cousin of the king and a recent wartime commander in Southeast Asia, is sent with instructions to complete the transfer of power by June 1948. Within weeks of arriving, Mountbatten makes a decision that will shape everything that follows. He pulls the deadline forward by almost a full year. The new date for British withdrawal is August 15, 1947. That leaves barely 10 weeks to divide the administration of a country of 400 million people. The civil service, the armed forces, the treasury, the railways, the postal system, the water supplies of whole provinces, all of it must be split in two. The split is required because the Muslim League has insisted on a separate homeland for the Muslim population of the subcontinent. Jinnah has argued for years that Muslims and Hindus cannot live as equals inside a single, independent India dominated by the Congress Party. Congress leaders, including Gandhi, resist partition until the last possible moment. Faced with the collapse of public order and communal killings already beginning in cities like Calcutta, they accept it. The country will be divided. The majority Hindu regions will become the new Dominion of India. The majority Muslim regions will become the new Dominion of Pakistan, which will itself consist of two separate territories on either side of India, more than 1,000 miles apart. The problem is that two of the largest provinces, Punjab in the northwest and Bengal in the east, have no clean majority. They contain millions of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs living side by side in villages and towns that have existed together for centuries. The task of drawing the actual border through those two provinces is given to a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe. He arrives in India for the first time in his life on the 8th of July, 1947. He has 5 weeks to finish the line. He has no experience of the subcontinent, no knowledge of local geography, no familiarity with its languages, religions, or economic systems. He is given outdated census data and maps. The two boundary commissions assigned to help him are split evenly between Congress and Muslim League appointees, who deadlock on every major decision. The final calls are left to Radcliffe alone. The Radcliffe Line is finished on August 12th. Mountbatten does not publish it until August 17th, 2 days after independence. By then, the new countries have already been declared and their governments sworn in without anyone knowing where the border actually runs. Once the line is published, the subcontinent explodes. The Radcliffe Line cuts villages in half. It separates farms from their wells. It divides cities between their railway stations and their factories. In Punjab, which now straddles both countries, Hindus and Sikhs find themselves suddenly on the Pakistani side. Muslims find themselves suddenly on the Indian side. Both populations begin to move. Between 12 and 20 million people attempt to cross the new border in the weeks and months that follow, making it one of the largest human migrations ever recorded. The migration becomes a slaughter. Trains leaving one country for the other are stopped in open country and their passengers massacred. Some trains arrive at their destinations carrying nothing but corpses. Refugee caravans on foot, stretching for miles along the roads, are ambushed by armed bands. Villages are burned. Women on both sides are raped in vast numbers. Estimates of the number killed during the partition violence range from 200,000 at the lowest end to around 2 million at the highest. The scholarly middle estimate commonly cited in modern works places the figure at around 1 million. The violence is concentrated in Punjab and Bengal, but no part of the subcontinent is untouched. Sikhs, whose homeland is split roughly down the middle by the line, suffer among the highest proportional casualties. Muslim communities in cities like Delhi and Lucknow are attacked by mobs. Hindu communities in cities like Lahore and Rawalpindi are driven out. Lahore, which before partition had been one of the great multi-religious cities of South Asia, loses almost its entire Hindu and Sikh population within weeks. The British military response is minimal. A Punjab boundary force of around 50,000 men is assembled to keep order across a territory of tens of thousands of square miles. That works out to less than 1 soldier per square mile. The force is disbanded after barely a month. Both new governments, Indian and Pakistani, are too overwhelmed by the refugee crisis to do much more. Mountbatten returns to London shortly after independence. Radcliffe destroys his working papers and leaves India, never to return. He refuses the fee he had been promised for the work, saying he does not want to be paid for what he has done. He rarely speaks of it publicly again. The Radcliffe Line is still the India-Pakistan border today. It also forms the border between India and Bangladesh, the eastern half of Pakistan that seceded after its own war in 1971. 3 wars have been fought across the line. A 4th conflict, in Kashmir, has never ended. Both countries now possess nuclear weapons. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What had been a deliberate political act of imperial theater to cover the rushed withdrawal had an even darker twin a generation earlier. Another empire retreat, another mass gathering, another day of blood. But that one took place inside a walled garden, and it happened under the orders of a single man. Section 9. The Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar Massacre of 1919. Amritsar, April of 1919. A correspondent walking through the old city of Punjab would feel the tension before they saw it. The streets are thick with rumor, the shops are closing early, and the British garrison is moving troops through neighborhoods that have not seen soldiers in years. Within 2 weeks, the garden at the center of the old city will become the name that comes to define an empire. To understand what happens on the 13th of April, a correspondent has to understand what the war has changed. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the British Armed Forces during the First World War. They fought in France, in the Middle East, in East Africa. Around 74,000 of them died. At home in India, their families endured wartime taxes, grain requisitions, and an influenza pandemic in 1918 that killed millions more. Nationalist leaders across the country expected, in exchange, a measured move toward self-government. What the Indian population receives instead, in early 1919, is the Rowlatt Act. The Rowlatt Act extends emergency wartime powers into peacetime. It allows the police to detain suspected political agitators without trial. It suspends habeas corpus in the provinces where unrest is feared. Indian members of the Imperial Legislative Council vote against it unanimously. The British members push it through anyway. The response from the Indian public is immediate. Strikes, rallies, and shutdowns spread across the country. The leader who emerges at the center of the agitation is Mohandas Gandhi, recently returned from South Africa, calling for non-violent non-cooperation. The province of Punjab takes the government's anger especially hard. The Lieutenant Governor, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, believes in firm, preemptive repression. In early April, he authorizes the arrest of 2 local Congress leaders in Amritsar, a Muslim lawyer named Saifuddin Kichelu and a Hindu physician named Satyapal. They are deported from the city. On April 10th, crowds in Amritsar march peacefully to demand their release. British troops fire on the march. A group of protesters then turns violent. 5 Europeans are killed in the riots that follow, and a female missionary is beaten in the street. the British authorities lose control of the city for 2 days. To restore it, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, a career officer from Jalandhar, is sent into Amritsar with troops. Dyer arrives on the 11th of April. On the morning of the 13th of April, he issues a proclamation banning all public meetings. His men walk through the city reading the proclamation aloud in English, Urdu, Hindi, and Punjabi. It is read at 19 locations. Much of the city does not hear it, either because the proclamation is read in areas where few people are, or because visitors from the surrounding countryside, in town for the festival of Baisakhi, never encounter it at all. Baisakhi is a Sikh religious festival and a Punjabi harvest celebration. Amritsar, which contains the Golden Temple, fills on that day with visitors from villages across the province. By the early afternoon of the 13th of April, a crowd begins to gather at a walled garden in the center of the old city called Jallianwala Bagh. Some have come for a political meeting organized by local Congress members to protest the Rowlatt Act. Many others have simply come to sit in the shade after visiting the temple. The crowd grows into the afternoon. By the time it is at its fullest, it contains at least 10,000 people, including men, women, and children. The Jallianwala Bagh is not really a garden. It is an enclosed space surrounded on almost every side by the walls of the houses that back onto it. There is only one main entrance, a narrow passageway barely wide enough to admit a horse. Dyer is informed around 12:30 that the meeting is planned. He decides that the gathering is, in his own judgment, a challenge to his authority. He does not send a messenger into the garden to warn people to disperse. He does not wait. At around 5 in the afternoon, he marches to Jallianwala Bagh at the head of a detachment of around 90 soldiers, mostly Gurkha and Sikh troops of the British Indian Army. He brings 2 armored cars, which cannot fit through the narrow entrance and are left outside. Dyer enters the garden through the single passageway. He positions his men across it, blocking the only exit. He gives no warning. He gives no order to disperse. He simply commands his troops to open fire. The soldiers fire for roughly 10 minutes. They fire 1,650 rounds of ammunition. Dyer directs their aim toward the densest parts of the crowd, including the areas where people are trying to climb the walls to escape or running toward the blocked exit. When his men pause to reload, he orders them to continue. People leap into a well inside the garden to escape the bullets. The well becomes a mass grave. Those who survive the jump are crushed or drowned by the weight of others falling on top of them. When the firing finally stops, the soldiers turn around and march out of the garden. They take no wounded with them. They summon no medical help. They leave the dead and dying on the ground behind them and go back to their barracks. The official British count of the dead, produced by the Hunter Commission, which investigates the incident the following year, is 379. Around 1,200 people are wounded. The Indian National Congress conducts its own investigation and puts the dead at over 1,000. The real figure is almost certainly somewhere between those two numbers and has never been precisely established. In London, the reaction splits the political establishment. The House of Commons formally censures Dyer. Secretary of State for War Winston Churchill denounces the massacre in the Commons as monstrous. The Hunter Commission finds that Dyer acted with excessive force. He is relieved of his command and forced to retire. But the House of Lords, by a comfortable majority, votes to support him. The conservative newspaper, The Morning Post, opens a public subscription for Dyer. It raises around £26,000, a fortune for the time, donated in part by British residents of India. Dyer is presented with a jeweled sword inscribed with the title Savior of the Punjab. The rifles that fired into the crowd at Jallianwala Bagh were only one instrument of imperial power. The other, quieter, slower, and more devastating in its long-term effects, was already dismantling the economic life of a continent that the empire had first claimed to come for trade. Section 10. The Destruction of Indian Industry and the Permanent Economic Shift. Dhaka, the 1820s. A correspondent walking through what had been, only 2 generations earlier, one of the richest manufacturing cities in the world, would find something close to a ruin. The weaving sheds are empty. The master craftsmen who produced the finest cotton cloth on earth are gone, some dead, others reduced to working as day laborers on the land outside the city. The population of Dhaka, which in the 1760s was several 100,000, has collapsed to around 50,000. This is what an industrial death looks like when the industry is not allowed to die naturally. To understand what Britain did to the Indian economy, a correspondent has to begin with what the Indian economy was before Britain arrived. In the middle of the 18th century, the Indian subcontinent is one of the great manufacturing regions of the world. The economic historian Paul Bayrock, working from the best available data, estimates that in 1750, India alone accounts for around a quarter of the world's total manufacturing output. China produces most of the rest. Together, the 2 Asian economies produce roughly 57% of everything manufactured on Earth. Europe, including Britain, produces considerably less. India's great industry is textiles. Bengal, Gujarat, and the Coromandel coast are world centers of cotton weaving and spinning. Indian chintz, muslin, and calico are in demand from the royal courts of Europe to the plantations of the Caribbean. The muslin of Dhaka, which can be woven so fine that 6 yards of it pass through a finger ring, is valued above almost any other cloth on earth. The British East India Company, like the French and the Dutch, began in India as a buyer of cloth, not a seller. Between 1750 and 1900, that relationship is completely reversed. The destruction begins with legislation in London, long before the company becomes a political power in India. British wool and silk producers, seeing their home market threatened by cheap Indian imports, push Parliament to protect them. The Calico Act of 1700 bans the import of most printed Indian cotton into England. The Calico Act of 1721 goes further. It bans the wearing of most Indian cotton fabrics inside Britain at all. Anyone caught in possession of the cloth faces a fine. Indian textiles remain available on the European continent and in the Americas, but their biggest and richest single market is closed to them by law. The second stage begins after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when the East India Company takes political control of Bengal. What had been a commercial relationship becomes an extractive one. Company officials, now backed by their own private army, impose new conditions on the weavers of Bengal. Weavers are required to sell their cloth only to company agents. The prices they are paid are fixed by the company, often at levels below production cost. Weavers who attempt to work for other buyers are fined, jailed, or, according to contemporary accounts, physically punished. In some districts, weavers reportedly cut off their own thumbs to escape the contracts that bound them. The third stage begins with the Industrial Revolution in Britain. From the 1780s, new spinning and weaving machines in Lancashire dramatically lower the cost of British cotton cloth. By 1812, the price of yarn in Britain has fallen to around 1/10 of what it was a generation earlier. Machine-made British cloth begins flooding into India. Under earlier Indian rulers, it would have faced high import tariffs. Under British rule, it does not. The Indian market is wide open. At the same time, Indian cloth exported to Britain faces duties of 70 or 80%, duties deliberately set to price Indian cloth out of the British market. It is not a fair fight. It was never designed to be one. The company, and later the British Crown after 1858, also reshapes India's agriculture to serve the new arrangement. Farmers in Bengal are pressured into growing opium for the China trade and indigo for British dye works on terms so harsh that they produce periodic rural uprisings. Farmers in central India and the Deccan are pressured into growing raw cotton for shipment to the Lancashire mills. The finished cloth made from that cotton is then shipped back to India and sold, often to the descendants of the weavers who had once produced the same cloth themselves. The statistical result is one of the steepest economic collapses in recorded history. India's share of world manufacturing output, around 25% in 1750, falls to less than 20% by 1800, less than 10% by 1860, and around 2% by 1900. British exports of cotton cloth into India rise from around 60 million yards in 1830 to close to 1 billion yards by 1870, more than 3 yards per year for every man, woman, and child on the subcontinent. The proportion of Indian industrial workers who are spinners collapses from around 82% of the industrial workforce in the early 19th century to roughly 15% by 1901. The human side of that statistical collapse is what the records hold. The economist Robert Allen, in his long study of Indian wages, has shown that the real wages of Indian laborers fell by around 23% between 1595 and 1961, with the lowest point reached under British rule. By the time the empire leaves in 1947, poverty rates in India, on the calculations of the same scholar, have risen from around 23% in 1810 to more than 50%. Literacy, life expectancy, and average height among the population all decline over the course of the colonial period. The empire arrived in India, in its own telling, to trade. What it produced over the course of 2 centuries was the destruction of the greatest manufacturing region in Asia, the conversion of its people into suppliers of raw material for British factories, and a structure of poverty so deep that it would outlive the empire itself by generations. The 10 stories a correspondent on the ground in the years of British imperial power would have reported are not the sum of the empire. They are not even a complete list of its brutalities. But taken together, they describe a system that moved food out of starving countries, bodies across oceans, drugs into populations that had banned them, camps into the fields of conquered farmers, and lines across living communities on deadlines measured in weeks. The survivors of each of these stories carried what happened forward into the countries that came after, and what happened in each of them can still be found, if anyone chooses to look, in documents the empire itself produced, and sometimes tried to burn before the world could read them. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.